A loaf of white bread sits on a kitchen counter. Day 1, day 7, day 14, day 21. Not a single spot of mold. Meanwhile, a loaf from a small local bakery, made with nothing but flour, water, salt, and yeast, turned green and fuzzy inside 5 days. Same category of food. Same shelf. Same air in the room. One decayed the way food is supposed to decay. The other just sat there, looking exactly the same on day 21 as it did on day 1. That's not a fluke, that's chemistry. And once you understand what's actually keeping that loaf fresh, you'll never look at a bread aisle the same way again. Bread used to be about as simple as food gets. Flour, water, salt, a living culture of use. 4 ingredients, thousands of years of history, and a shelf life measured in days, because that's what happens to real food. It changes, it dries out, it eventually spoils, because it was alive. Walk into a modern supermarket and pick up a loaf, and you'll often find a list of 10, 15, sometimes 20 ingredients, half of which sound like they belong in a chemistry set rather than a bakery. And the packaging will still show you a wheat field at sunset, a smiling baker, the word traditional in a rustic font. That gap between the picture on the bag and the paragraph on the back is where this video lives. We're going to look at how a handful of massive companies quietly control most of what you think are independent bread brands. How food labeling rules let manufacturers leave certain chemicals off the ingredient list entirely, which loaves you should probably put back on the shelf, and which ones are actually worth your money. By the end, you'll have a genuinely simple way to judge any loaf of bread in about 5 seconds, using nothing but your eyes. To understand how bread got this strange, we need to start with who's actually making it. Because the answer isn't what most people assume. Open your pantry and you'll probably find bread from what looks like a handful of different companies. Different names, different packaging, different price points. In many countries, though, a surprisingly small number of parent corporations own most of the major bread brands sitting side by side on that shelf. It's a pattern that shows up across a lot of the packaged food industry, not just bread. A small number of conglomerates operating dozens of brands designed to look like they're competing with each other, when in reality they're the same company selling you the illusion of choice. That matters because it explains something that used to be confusing. Why so many different loaves taste, feel, and behave almost identically. They're often built on the same industrial baking process, developed decades ago to make bread cheaper and faster to produce at massive scale. That process prioritizes speed, uniformity, and shelf life over the qualities that made bread nutritious and easy to digest in the first place. Which brings us to the actual mystery. Real food rots. That's not a flaw. It's the sign the food was alive and unprocessed enough for airborne mold spores and natural yeast to do what they've done to grain-based foods for thousands of years. Mold needs moisture and organic material to grow, and a genuine loaf of bread has plenty of both. So when a factory-made loaf sits on a counter for 3 weeks without a trace of decay, that's not a testament to cleanliness. It's a sign that something in that loaf is actively working against the natural biology of spoilage. Preservatives, mold inhibitors, dough conditioners, a whole toolkit of additives designed for exactly one purpose, extending the fight between your bread and the natural world for as long as possible. So the real question isn't whether these ingredients exist, it's why so few of us have ever actually seen them listed on the label. And that's where things get genuinely frustrating. You'd assume that if a chemical goes into your bread, it has to appear on the ingredient list. That seems like the entire point of an ingredient list. But food regulations in many countries include a category called processing aids, substances used somewhere during manufacturing that are considered to serve a functional purpose during production rather than in the finished product, and which regulators allow companies to leave off the label entirely if they're used in small enough amounts. In practice, that means a substance can be present in the dough during baking and simply not appear anywhere on the ingredient list you're reading in the store. Then there's what food writers and nutritionists often call the clean label trick. Instead of listing a synthetic mold inhibitor by its chemical name, a manufacturer can use an ingredient like cultured wheat flour or cultured dextrose, which are fermented products that occur naturally but are specifically added to bread because they extend shelf life in a similar way to synthetic preservatives, while sounding entirely wholesome on the label. It's not necessarily dishonest in a legal sense, But it is a clever piece of linguistic engineering, designed to make an industrial shortcut sound like a farmhouse recipe. It's also worth knowing that regulatory standards aren't consistent worldwide. Certain dough conditioners and bleaching agents that are commonly used in commercial baking in some countries are restricted or banned in others. Often after those countries' food safety bodies reviewed the available research and decided the risk-benefit balance didn't hold up. That doesn't mean every additive on a bread label is dangerous. Most have been studied and approved by food safety agencies. But it does mean approved and necessary are two very different things, and it's worth asking why an ingredient banned for bread in one country is still standard practice in another. With that regulatory backdrop in mind, let's actually look at what tends to show up in mainstream commercial bread. The loaves, sitting in the biggest, most familiar section of the bread aisle. A lot of these loaves lean on a category of ingredients called emulsifiers, often listed under names or numbers like mono and diglycerides, datamine, or soy lecithin. Their job is to keep the crumbs soft and uniform and to help the bread survive being sliced by machine and shipped across the country without falling apart. On their own, most emulsifiers are considered safe by food regulators. But some early research has started looking at how certain synthetic emulsifiers interact with the gut microbiome, with a handful of studies suggesting they may disrupt the protective mucus layer in the intestines in animal models. This is still an active and evolving area of research, not a settled conclusion. But it's exactly the kind of question that never gets raised when the packaging shows nothing but a golden crust and a rustic wooden table. Then there are dough conditioners and gluten-boosting agents, added to make weaker or lower quality flour behave like a much higher protein flour. This lets manufacturers use cheaper wheat while still getting that tall, airy, spongy texture people associate with fresh bakery bread. It's a purely cosmetic and economic fix. It makes cheap flour perform like expensive flour without making it nutritionally equivalent. And here's something worth sitting with. Price doesn't reliably tell you which is which. A premium-priced, artisan-style loaf from a major manufacturer can carry nearly the same list of industrial additives as the cheapest store-brand white bread sitting next to it. The high price often buys you nicer packaging and a more appealing name, not a meaningfully different production process. That's a hard thing to accept because we're conditioned to associate price with quality. In bread, that link is far weaker than most people assume. Now, all of that is frustrating on its own, but there's one category of bread that tends to sting more than any other because it's the one specifically marketed to people trying to eat well. These are the loaves branded around words like multigrain, whole grain, ancient grain, or stone-baked, often wrapped in packaging that leans hard into rustic farmhouse imagery. A mill, a wheat sheaf, sometimes literally the word village in the name. These products are positioned as a responsible, health-forward choice sitting right next to the junk white bread. And for a lot of shoppers trying to eat better, this is exactly the loaf they reach for. Here's the catch. Multigrain simply means the bread contains more than one type of grain. It says nothing about whether those grains are whole or refined. A loaf can be made almost entirely from refined white flour, then colored a deeper brown using caramel coloring. So it looks like a hearty, fiber-rich whole grain loaf, while nutritionally behaving much closer to white bread. The dark color your eye associates with healthy whole grain can be, quite literally, food dyed doing the work that actual bran and germ are supposed to do. The tell is usually shelf life. If a loaf marketed as wholesome and traditional still has an expiration date 3 or 4 weeks out, ask yourself what's keeping it that stable for that long. Because true whole grain flour actually spoils faster than refined white flour. The natural oils in the wheat germ go rancid over time. A genuinely whole grain loaf with a long shelf life is, in a strange way, a contradiction. Something has to be counteracting that natural process, and that something is rarely just good baking technique. At this point, you might be thinking that spending more or buying organic automatically solves this problem. It's a reasonable assumption, and it's often wrong. Organic certification restricts certain pesticides and synthetic additives, but it doesn't automatically mean short shelf life, minimal ingredients, or true whole grain content. You can find organic commercial bread with a dozen ingredients and a 3-week shelf life sitting right next to conventional bread with the exact same shelf stability. The organic label tells you something real about how the wheat was grown. It doesn't tell you much about how the bread was engineered to survive on a truck for 2 weeks before it even reaches the store. So if price and organic labeling aren't reliable shortcuts, what actually works? This is where the picture gets a lot more encouraging because the honest options aren't rare or expensive. They're just easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. Start with the in-store bakery section, usually tucked somewhere near the entrance or the deli counter. Separate from the packaged bread aisle. These loaves are typically baked on-site or shipped par-baked and finished in-store. And because they're meant to be sold within a day or two, they generally don't need the same level of chemical preservation as something designed to survive weeks in a distribution warehouse. Not every in-store bakery is equally good. Some still use pre-made, additive-heavy dough bases, but as a category, they tend to have dramatically shorter and simpler ingredient lists than packaged commercial bread. The single best shortcut here is shelf life itself. A loaf that visibly stales or begins to show mold within about 3 to 5 days is behaving the way bread is biologically supposed to behave. That's not a flaw in the product. That's evidence that you're looking at actual food, not a shelf-stable simulation of food. If you've been trained to see mold as a warning sign about food quality in general, it's worth flipping that instinct specifically for bread. Mold showing up on schedule is often the healthiest sign a loaf can give you. Beyond the in-store bakery, there are commercial brands built specifically around a short ingredient list: flour, water, salt, and a leavening agent, sometimes with a small recognizable list of seeds or grains added. These brands exist precisely because enough consumers started asking these questions, and they're usually easy to spot once you start reading labels instead of just looking at packaging, because the ingredient list is genuinely short enough to read in 5 seconds. And that brings us to what many food scientists and nutritionists consider the gold standard of bread: genuine long fermentation sourdough. Real sourdough isn't made with commercial yeast at all. It relies on a living culture of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria cultivated over days that ferments the dough slowly, often for 12 to 24 hours or longer. During that extended fermentation, the lactobacilli bacteria in the starter break down a meaningful portion of the gluten proteins and also reduce phytic acid, a compound in grain that can interfere with how your body absorbs certain minerals. This is well documented in food science research on fermentation, and it's the reason a lot of people who feel bloated or sluggish after regular bread report feeling noticeably better after true sourdough. The fermentation process has already done part of the digestive work before the bread ever reaches your stomach. The problem is that sourdough isn't a protected term in most places, which means plenty of commercial bread gets labeled sourdough while being made almost entirely with fast-acting commercial yeast, with a small amount of vinegar or sourdough flavoring added afterward purely for taste. It gets you the tang without the actual 12-hour fermentation and without any of the digestive benefits. The giveaway is usually, again, shelf life and ingredient count. Authentic sourdough tends to have a short shelf life and a short ingredient list, typically just flour, water, salt, and starter. If a sourdough loaf has a long list of additives and sits on the shelf for weeks, the tang is likely coming from a bottle, not from 24 hours of fermentation. So how do you take all of this and actually use it? Standing in a bread aisle with 15 options and about 10 seconds to decide. 3 simple checks. First, the finger press test. Press a spot on the loaf gently. Real bread with real moisture and structure will spring back at least partially. Bread that's been engineered with excess emulsifiers and conditioners often stays compressed or springs back in a strange, uniform, almost rubbery way because its texture has been chemically standardized rather than naturally developed. Second, the shelf life reality check. Look at the expiration date relative to today. If a loaf sitting on the shelf right now is dated 3 or 4 weeks out, that's your single clearest signal that this bread has been engineered for stability, not nutrition. Third, and simplest of all, the ingredient count rule. Flip the bag over. If you count more than roughly 5 ingredients, or if you hit a word you can't pronounce or explain, put it back. This one rule alone eliminates the vast majority of heavily processed commercial bread without requiring you to memorize a single chemical name. Go back to that pristine loaf sitting untouched for 21 days. It wasn't defying nature. It was engineered, ingredient by ingredient, regulatory loophole by regulatory loophole, to look like food while behaving like something closer to packaging. Real bread spoils because it's alive, and eating things that are still capable of being alive. Capable of feeding mold, going stale, changing over time is one of the simplest markers that you're feeding your body, something your digestive system actually recognizes. That's really the whole shift here. Not fear, not an impossible standard, just a different question to ask standing in the bread aisle. Not, does this look wholesome, but would this loaf actually go bad if I left it alone? The best bread, like most good things, is supposed to have an expiration date that means something. Next time you're in that aisle, try it. Pick up your usual loaf, flip it over, count the ingredients, check the date. Then drop what you found in the comments. You might be surprised by what's been sitting in your bread box the whole time.